Well, as Scott mentioned, mental health organisations have today written that open letter to the federal government over funding for services. They say the future of crucial mental health services is uncertain, and they've urged the government to guarantee ongoing funding.
Well, joining us in the studio is former police officer and mental health advocate Allan Sparkes to discuss this issue. Allan, welcome and thanks so much for coming on in.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Kumi.
Thanks for having me.
You were an experienced and decorated police officer. Can you tell us how and why your life started to unravel?
I developed post-traumatic stress disorder coupled with chronic depression following the murder of two of my colleagues some years ago. And shortly after that, I was involved in the rescue of a small child in pretty horrific circumstances. And that's a stage where my mental health started to deteriorate rapidly, and I foolishly did not take it upon myself to seek professional care. I thought I could overcome the symptoms that I was suffering. But my health started to just continue to deteriorate to the stage where I became suicidal. And at that point, I didn't think that I had any chance of ever recovering, ever getting any assistance that may help me. And I developed these feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness, which are quite common amongst people who have become suicidal. Fortunately, through the intervention of my workmates and my wife, I was taken before a crisis counsellor, and then the following day to a psychiatrist in the public mental health system. And that was day one of my road to recovery.
That road to recovery, Allan, how long did it take? And it's an ongoing recovery for many sufferers of PTSD, but how many services did you access over that time? How often and how long was that road?
Initially, I was seeing a psychiatrist 3 days a week, and that was coupled with medication, antipsychotic medication, antidepressants, therapy, and guidance in relation to how I could rebuild my life.
Allan, given the numbers of Australians who have a mental illness or at risk of having an illness of some sort, and it's many of us in Australia, how is the level of accessibility to services, do you think? In other words, how much stress are these services under?
I think the demands upon these services is not publicly recognised. And the reality is, unless you're suffering from mental illness or your family member is suffering from mental illness, you have no real understanding of what actually takes place to a person's life during that stage. I think that compared to the services available when I became very sick, as compared to now, we do have a vast increase in services. And the level of professional assistance is quite exceptional compared to what it was. And that's through the dedication of staff who provide their services and their expertise to the services that we need. We know now statistically that 1 in 5 Australians will at some stage suffer mental illness in their lives. So there's a very, very high demand for these services, and it is absolutely crucial that we provide those services to the people who need them and their families, because if we don't, the ramifications are a life and death.
A lot of people think of services as that immediate need for a crisis intervention, which often is initially, but the knock-on effects, you've mentioned family a lot. We often talk about lives that are completely destroyed and have to be rebuilt in terms of social relationships, marriages, children, employment. How many other services are needed within that broad stretch of mental health when we often think of it as a targeted short-term crisis issue when it's actually a lifelong, broader whole schema that needs to be looked at? I
think the reality is that it's not often that people suddenly become mentally ill. Certainly in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, there's sometimes where an incident may cause a trigger. But generally it is a prolonged period of an exacerbation of symptoms. And therefore when somebody becomes an acute state, services have to be obtained there and then. I know from experience with friends and family, in relation to adolescents, the demands upon the adolescent mental health services are just extraordinary. In Sydney alone, it may take up to 8 to 10 weeks to even get an appointment to have your child taken to a mental health service provider such as Headspace, who do a phenomenal job. So the services aren't being, there's not sufficient funding at the moment to provide the need we have now, let alone for the future.
If there's uncertainty on continuing funding, what does that uncertainty do for not just the staff in these services, but for the clients who are reaching out to these services?
My belief is that when a person actually has the courage to say, I need help, and seeks the provision of services, it's them seeking some form of hope that they may get better and that they may ultimately be able to stop the desire to take their own life or similar feelings. So it's so important that these services continue to provide that hope, because sometimes that's a fine thread between a person taking their own life and surviving, is that the fact that somebody cares about them. And I think it's important to remember that these people who work in these services, they work in a very particular field, a very emotional field, a very challenging field, and they're not there to do a job. They care so much about what they want to do, and that care then transfers to the person who's seeking these services.
Allan, many people may look at you, your work and your life. You're one of very few Australians awarded our highest bravery honour, talking about the story that and the trauma that you've been through, and say, well, he's seen a lot more than I have. He's been challenged a lot more than I have. I don't feel like I'm worthy enough of feeling the way I do. I can see why he does, but what about me? And sort of push it into a box. What would you say to people who feel like their trauma and the feelings they're suffering don't compare to other people's?
I think anybody who suffers any form of mental illness, especially the ones that I suffered from, PTSD and depression, anybody who suffers those, I say we all suffer the same. And it doesn't matter what you've been through that causes that, it's the fact that you are suffering. So it doesn't matter whether you're from the military, the emergency services, a citizen. If you are suffering, we all share the same symptoms. We all share the same agony. We all know the trauma it causes to our families. And everybody is equal in that. It's those that don't know what it's like, who've never experienced a suffering, either as a carer or as a sufferer, can really understand what it's like. And I think it's, I would respectfully suggest to our government leaders that they perhaps live the life of somebody for 24 hours in that family, just to know what it's like for these families who are seeking out for this care that's provided by the service providers.
Allan Sparkes, former policeman, mental health advocate and leader of an inspired and inspiring life. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Allan.
Thank you.